Of minutes. In fact, we're going to start in a couple of seconds. In fact, we're starting now. It's great to hear this kind of buzz in the auditorium, and I welcome you all. This on the poster is described as a graduate lecture series talk. I'd like to set the record straight, though, lest anybody be offended by the pretense of a grad lecture series talk sponsorship. It is not the case. It is a collaborative effort, a kind of grassroots movement to bring Mabel back to CCA. We do that as often as possible. The last time that she was out here was for the 10th anniversary of the Visual and Critical Studies program a few years back. One of the most prominent features of Mabel's CV was a brief but brilliant term as chair of Visual and Critical Studies right before she left us to go to Columbia. So it is with some kind of false pride that I, who came later in her footsteps, am here to introduce Mabel to all of you. Most of you already know Mabel better than I do. So I want to first say that this talk is hosted by Visual and Critical Studies with support from architecture, the entire architecture empire. I believe the division and MArt are both contributors to making tonight possible, but also just to give you some idea of the kind of breadth of support that this evening's experience enjoys. We are also sponsored by the Provost's office and by the President's Diversity Steering Group. So a lot of people coming together to make this this exciting opportunity available to us to hear about, to welcome Mabel back and especially to hear about her recently released book, which some of us, I hear, are already teaching out of. So that's pretty fantastic. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with Mabel O. Wilson, she is Associate Professor at Columbia University, in addition to being previous chair of Visual and Critical Studies at CCA, an architect and scholar whose interdisciplinary practice includes designing buildings, creating speculative installations, and writing. She's also one of the collaborators who founded Studio and Design Firm in New York, and her research examines the history of African American and Black diasporic culture within the built environment and expands the Euro-American legacy of architectural discourse. The book that she'll be talking about tonight, Negro Building, Black Americans and the World's Fairs and Museums, was released by UC Press a few months ago in 2012. Negro Building traces the evolution of Black public history from the Civil War through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. At the 2015 opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., as that approaches, that event kind of becomes imaginable on the horizon, this book is really very timely. It reveals why the Black cities of Chicago and Detroit became the sites of major Black historical museums rather than the nation's capital until at least 2015. More about all of that from Mabel directly. Thank you so much for coming, Mabel.
Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. Thank you, Tirza, for that really fantastic introduction. And also for the invitation to return to CCA. I just wanted to thank Isla and everybody in architecture for bringing me back. I didn't realize the provost and the president and all of these various folks, contributed. But that's what was really great about being at CCA was this book is actually the outcome of conversations that I had with students that I was teaching both in architecture. I taught a studio that was called Museum in Black, which was actually housing the Black Panther Party collection in Oakland, which was a really great, great studio, but also with my visual and critical studies students. But I also had amazing conversations with wonderful colleagues and an amazing array of friends that supported me through the research and the writing of this project. So I just wanted to say thank you to many of you who are in the audience for that, for the beers in my courtyard with Tamana and Donald and Sandra, to really great friends like Sandra Vivanco, Neil Schwartz, Ron Flynn, Lisa Finley. I mean, there's so many people I could just go on. So if I didn't mention your name, I just wanted to say thank you. But you really did make this work possible. And so what I wanted to do is just sort of put this book in context, because one of the things I enjoyed about being at CCA, was the fact that somebody with an architecture background actually could teach visual and critical studies, but could, go into Lynn Kirby's film class and actually talk about my work, or, and so there were so many opportunities for the exchange of ideas across disciplines, and I think it really enriched my thinking and also the way in which I work. So I like to think of myself as somebody who works on the built environment, but does so through writings, through buildings, through art projects, through activism. And I think, my time here at CCA clearly kind of led me down that road and on that trajectory. So about 6 years ago, I had a partnership with Paul Karajuk for about 10 years. And about 6 years ago, we split off, and I started something called 610 Studio, which is now Studio And. And so... so it became Studio And becomes a useful umbrella to house my transdisciplinary practice. So let me just go forward. So this is a projects and writing matrix that basically schematizes a selection of work that is my work sort of as an architect, artist, and cultural historian. The writing projects are basically on the left, the design projects are on the right, and then anywhere there's a kind of like arcing vector, it shows the relationship. If there's none there, then it sort of stayed either in the writing realm or it stayed in the project realm. So over the past 20 years, my creative trajectory has really traversed many disciplinary limits to really engage in cross-border relationships that encounter the antagonisms between disciplines, fields, and professions. So sometimes not everything gets along well. So my talk this evening will focus on two strands in my design and writing, both race, space, and architecture, and cultural memory. The condensation of a lot of those years of research, which includes doing some competitions, which I'll talk about, really has condensed into the book, Negro Building. And so, as with any research project, you have to be open to discovery, unexpected turns, in the project. For example, my editor hated my original title for my book, which was Progress and Prospects, which my dean thought sounded like a romantic novel. And then I was also underwhelmed by the proposed cover. And this was what was great about the CCA community. I immediately called my graphic design coalition, Steve Jones. I contacted Leslie Becker, Lucille Tanassis, and I'm like, help, get me out of this. So, and in fact, it was sort of through their input and Lucille's kind of direction that I ended up with the cover that I did, which was a big saver. Steve can attest to the original, cover. So any kind of design process, any kind of writing process, you have to really be open to unexpected turns and discovery. So the seeds of this project were planted, or rather unearthed. Slide this forward. With my interest in the documentation and discovery of the African burial ground in the early 1990s. This was it was a colonial burial ground that had functioned basically outside the city walls, because in the 18th century, Black Manhattanites were not permitted to be buried within the city limits. So these were a series of essays that I sort of worked through this this site to examine the battles between local activists and the Government Services Administration, the GSA, about what to do with the site. Because the GSA actually wanted to dig up the bodies. If the bodies were removed, of course they would be studied, but if the bodies were removed, it was no longer a historical site. So the activists were basically trying to shut down the excavation. So the conflict over the lost burial ground and how to commemorate it demonstrated how a constellation of historical and contemporary racial, political, and economic forces impacted the power of Black Americans to claim symbolic representation in the nation's civic spaces. So drawing on this expertise, my practice, KWA, with Paul, along with collaborators Dean Wolf Architects, Walter Hood of Hood Design, and my uncle, who's an artist, John Outerbridge, we were selected as finalists from a national pool of architects for the GSA's competition for the site. Our entry, Sacred Ground, recognized the importance of maintaining the site as a hallowed space of burial through the creation of a public garden and memorial enclosure. So we believed that through cultivating the garden, people would actually remember the site. And part of the problem with the current site is nobody remembers what the site is for. It's got a beautiful, beautiful granite memorial designed by fantastic architect Rodney Leon, but it's hard to recall why it's there on a regular basis. So it's the challenge of cultural memory. So for us, the civic caretakers of the new garden would be charged with cultivating the collective memory of the burial ground and those who had been interred there. So my early work on Black cultural memory provided an easy transition into the foundational themes of Negro Building. While Negro Building's chapters explore a range of topics from urban history to political and intellectual history, the preliminary research and articles studied the emergence of Black history and cultural museums erected in the 1980s to understand how these institutions took root in formerly segregated social and urban spaces, ones with difficult histories of racial violence. So initially what I was interested in places like Birmingham, Alabama, for example, which has erected monuments and hosts the stately brick edifice, the Civil Rights Museum. So this is the monument erected to that very famous photograph in Kelly Ingram Park. And so this is the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that was designed by J. Max Bond. So elsewhere, you also get this in Memphis's National Civil Rights Museum, which occupies the renovated Lorraine Motel, where exhibits and programs memorialize the site where an assassin's bullet took the life of civil rights leader Martin Luther King in 1968. So here's that iconic image just after King has been shot. This is the part of the motel that's basically been preserved, and there's the memorial plaque that was there. And then it's attached to this museum. And so these were early examples where this question of the representation of Black identity within civic spaces, particularly ones where segregation had not allowed this kind of occupation of the primary civic spaces of places like Birmingham and Memphis, really led to a kind of museum renaissance in the 1980s. And there's still additions to be added to this. The most significant endeavor on the boards is the Smithsonian's new National Museum of African American History and Culture. That particular museum has an incredible history, which I cover in the book. It runs parallel to a lot of what I look at in the book. But there was a competition for the museum building in about 2 years ago. And I was really privileged to collaborate with Diller Scafidio Renfro, Hood Design Again, and Kling Stubbins. And so this is the project that we proposed. We did not win, but a really fantastic building designed by David Adjaye, Phil Freelon, and the late Max Bond is the museum that's under constructed. And it's huge. It's a 300,000 square foot museum and research facility. And so it's going to be built on one of the last remaining unbuilt sites on the National Mall. So it's very, very, very prominent. And so I'll say a little bit more about the significance of this institution when it gets built, when it opens in 2015. So taking stock of these laudable advances, Negro Building's research poses two questions. One is, what does it mean for Black Americans to claim a physical space in the nation's symbolic cultural landscape? And two, what does it mean for Black Americans to claim a symbolic space in the nation's historical consciousness? I argue in the book that these have been two spheres in which their presence and contributions have been calculatingly rendered invisible for over 2 centuries. So part of what the project asked was, and I was interested in these more recent museums, like the National Museum on the Mall and what was going on in the 1980s. These new museums are going up. There's the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati. There's MOAD here in San Francisco. So they were all kind of part of a continuity of institutions that were being built. You know, but I wanted to know, was there something earlier than that? And so for the architectural and curatorial precedents to these contemporary Black museums of history and culture, we have to look back to over 100 years, beginning in the period after Reconstruction, to explore the Great World's Fair's Negro buildings that were first erected in 1895, with the last appearing in 1936. Now, what was a Negro building? So my initial response when I first saw the image was literally, I was like, what is this? You know, and so as an architect, I was like, what, a Negro, what does that mean? So the first one was built, this is the first one, it was in 1895 at the Atlanta's World's Fair. Now, you know, anybody who's done any kind of research of any sort, you know, it's like once you start digging through archives and whatever, you know, of course this can't be the only one, right? So, you know, then we found another one. There was this one in 1895. This is where there's a Parthenon built in Nashville. So that's the fair that was built at. And then there's another one in 1901 at Charleston World's Fair. So it actually is a kind of architectural typology. And then there was another one in 1907. This one was designed by Black architect William Pittman. And there were a couple of other ones, but the last appearance of a Negro building in a major World's Fair was in Dallas in 1937, which was called the Hall of Negro Life at the Texas Centennial. So, but why would the fairs, rather than museums, be an early venue for the display of Black life in America? I mean, this is one of the questions the book asks. So in the era of Jim Crowism, the fairs were temporary, not permanent. The great architectural talents of the time, Frederick Law Olmsted, Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, but then you get people later, Paul Cray, Raymond Hood. And then there were other people who were lesser known, like Bradford Gilbert, who did all of the buildings at the Atlanta Fair, Vertner Tandy, who was an African-American architect who did a lot of work in Harlem. They were the ones who built the phantasmal dream worlds that appeared for several months in metropolitan centers around the country. And they were actually really common. So anybody who's done World's Fairs research realizes these things were happening all the time. These men, and on occasion women, there were women architects who did work here, planned everything from the fairgrounds, the pavilions, to the layouts of the exhibits. An enraptured audience of future workers, managers, and owners marveled at the colorfully festooned halls and toured the impressive pavilion structures. Amid the wide open sunlit interiors filled with machines and manufacturers that turned the raw materials of the country into products before their very eyes, visitors witnessed a stunning visual teleology and geopolitical atlas about how past and future innovations, in fact, industrial capitalism, would transform their lives and the fortune of the nation. America's fairs paraded the nation's history as the natural outcome of an exceptional people destined to be great. This is often the rhetoric you hear in relation to the fair, and you still hear this today. Those powerful white politicians, manufacturers, and transportation titans who set the ideological tone for the expositions, who also funded the great museums, put the world from primitive to civilized on display so that the common sense of nation, race, and class could be known by those privileged to witness the spectacles. So within this comparative framework, what and who was shown or excluded reinforced beliefs that historically non-white peoples belonged in the lower ranks of civilization and the nation's advance. So it was sort of like, you know, putting up slides of everything and then comparing. And that's essentially how these fairgrounds were laid out. So you can literally go to Cairo one moment and then go to Belgium the next moment. You could see the advances your nations were making, but then you saw how these sort of primitive natives were behaving elsewhere. So you started to get the sense of where your nation fit in, you know, in that measurement of civilization. So, and this is really important because this was one of the first major fairs in the United States. This is from the Centennial Exposition, this engraving from 1876. And so this family of man, for the first Centennial Fair in Philadelphia, visualizes the progress of civilization. So you can see America, there she is in star-spangled dress. She's leading the way to Europe, right? So you can see Europe, she's wearing, noble purple, her noble purple dress, and she's carrying the shield of their shared paternity, which is very important. And they're showing the way for Europe, and then you see the dutiful noble savage, right? And he's the only male figure, which is very interesting. So he's on his knees, right? So he's bearing witness to what America is showing him westward. You see the timid Asia, she is crouching down, right, dressed in her natural dress. And then primitive Africa, right, with her rudimentary quiver of arrows, right? So that's an attestament to the fact that Africans will only ever be, hand workers, laborers. So as this mass-produced engraving for Leslie's Weekly, this is in 1876, circulated beyond the fairgrounds, it also presented this sort of message of civilization. So this was another way in which these ideas seen on the fairgrounds circulated elsewhere. And this is an amazing image because you can see sort of in the bottom, you could see the train tracks, right, that were moving the wealth. You see Philadelphia. And then in the distance, all the way in the back that looks like a mountain, that was the Great Hall in Philadelphia. And so there was definitely a kind of narrative of progress literally from train to steam to the representation of government to manufacture and production. Industrial capitalism is what's going to lead the nation forward, especially after the Civil War. So as a consequence of this racialized as well as spatialized, and this is great because you can actually see, and in the back you could see the globe behind this family of man. And so it's very much a geopolitical atlas. So you can see how this hierarchy and certain groups, especially Asians and Native Americans and Africans and American Negroes, were deemed exploitable for their resources and labor. In particular, this confirmed that black people were incapable of reason and judgment and therefore unworthy of basic human and democratic rights. Beyond the fairgrounds, it was collectively determined that, given their natural limitation, black Americans should be by law and custom excluded from the mainstream public sphere. They would be segregated into their own areas of the city and by extension of this logic, set apart in their own corner of the fairgrounds. This validated, as activist Ida B. Wells protested at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, the rise of Jim Crow de jure segregation and the structural dominance of white supremacy for decades to come. So in 1876, this is exactly where Reconstruction's ending and certain things are being put into place so that Jim Crowism and literally spatial racial segregation would keep black Americans, right, from gaining both political rights as well as private wealth. So what was a Negro Building? So the first one was erected at the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition held in Atlanta's Piedmont Park in 1895. Its contents was organized and curated by an emerging black elite class from Atlanta and other parts of the South, where 90% of blacks still resided. So most blacks were still living in the South at this time. Atlanta's exposition was organized by the city's white oligarchs, and these were the men who ran the railroads, they ran the businesses, and they ran the newspapers. And they wanted to position Atlanta and its rail yards, because Atlanta was founded, literally called Terminus, because it was a railroad's crossroad, as the industrial hub of what orators like Henry Grady christened as the New South, a wily down-home little cousin of its thriving kinfolk up north, Big Daddy Chicago. So they saw themselves as the leading industrial center for the South, as opposed to the plantation economy of Charleston and elsewhere, and the mercantile economy of places like New Orleans. So Frederick Law Olmsted visited Atlanta to be interviewed as the landscape architect for the Atlanta Fairgrounds. But given their limited resources, the organizing board tapped a local white engineer who employed black convict labor to grade the hilly terrain of the park. So to design the pavilions for their fairgrounds, the fair organizers hired Bradford Gilbert, a white New York architect. Gilbert had designed the New York Railroad building at the Great Chicago Fair and was known for his designs of railroad stations. As a cost-saving measure, Gilbert avoided the use of staff, which was a plaster-like material that gave the neoclassical buildings of the Chicago Fair, the famous White City, its signature glistening sheen. Instead, Gilbert opted to erect the halls in an angular neo-Romanesque style crafted from local pine, so he's making use of local materials. The final aesthetic of the pavilions reflected the dual nature of the New South's agenda. In some respects, the large clapboard halls, and you can see how they populated the fairground in this image. In some respects, the spared neoclassical columns and trim echoed the vernacular architecture of plantation homes that had long defined the economic and cultural character of the region. But in other ways, the great spans of the interiors, capable of housing entire train engines, captured the immense scale of factory spaces that the New South boosters hoped would symbolize the region's future prosperity. So these are Bradford Gilbert's designs for all the halls. So in celebration of the auspicious occasion of the fair, the Atlanta Constitution applauded the event's most unique symbols by proclaiming that, quote, the Paris Exposition had its Eiffel Tower, the World's Fair had its Ferris wheel, but Atlanta had its Negro Building, right? So, I mean, they really saw this as a prominent attraction to see, okay, what these black folks had made. But why was the Negro Building, housing black accomplishment, so important to the New South's ambitions? Erected in a corner of the fairgrounds, the Negro Building was sandwiched between the Body Midway Heights and the raucous grandstand of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Its construction by black workers and its display of buggies and steam engines and sewing crafts and wood turning all demonstrated to white capitalists and citizens the immense potential of black wage labor, workers who would man the New South's future factories. So actually what they saw was the black population moving to cities like Atlanta would basically be the workforce, basically the new workforce. Because what Southern whites in power were fearful of were the immigrant rabble, who they had no control over. So they saw what was happening in Chicago and they said, no, let's hire our locals. So it was a tribute to the tenets of what was called racial uplift, which was thrift, respectability, and hard work. Booker T. Washington, the powerful president of Tuskegee Institute, advocate of industrial education, and key organizer of the Negro Building, proclaimed in his famous accommodation speech made at the opening day ceremonies that, quote, our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands, end quote. So he was basically saying we are to be industrious, and we are to be farmers and wheelwrights and draymen and so forth. His straightforward metaphor of separate fingers representing a separate social order, but mutually dependent races, validated the rise of a segregationist mentality and acknowledged the Negro's place as a hand worker in the New South's economic order. So these are some of the shots of the interiors of the Negro Building. However, the message of racial uplift, the message to uplift the race through industrial education, was hindered by the caustic Jim Crow segregation that rationalized a separate pavilion to show black progress. Poor treatment of black fairgoers happened on the grounds, and then there were these denigrating depictions of coon shows, savage villages, and literally pancake hawking mammies seen on the fairgrounds. So on one hand, Booker T. Washington saying, oh, be patient, let's be patient. But on the other hand, for example, in the Midway, there was the old plantation. So it was yearning back to a kind of ideal image of plantation life. But what was interesting was that there were more radical ideas about black history and progress, such as the willingness to confront growing anti-black racism and segregation. And this was also being circulated around the Negro Building in Atlanta. Let me just go back. See. So if you actually look in the background of this image, there's a sculpture. And so one of the things that you actually do see on exhibit are paintings. They're paintings by a very well-known painter, Henry Osawa Tanner. There was Augusta Savage. So there were actually cultural artifacts and artworks on display which directly challenged this idea that blacks should not be writing poetry or making art or being lawyers or doctors and being consigned basically to work the fields. So there was already a kind of dissonant message happening in this building, regardless of Booker T. Washington's desire to basically have this coherent message of racial uplift. So right around Atlanta, shortly after the fair closed in 1895, arrives a young sociologist who was the first black doctoral graduate of Harvard University. His name was William Edward Burgard Du Bois, and he arrives to Atlanta in 1897 to teach at Atlanta University. He had been hired to organize the Atlanta Conferences, a yearly study of Negro life in cities. This is Du Bois. And in fact, the first event for this conference was supposed to have happened in the Negro Building at Atlanta. So in 1899, a college friend and fellow educator of Du Bois contacted him to contribute a sociological study to what was being called the American Negro exhibit. In all of the correspondences, they constantly refer to the Atlanta Negro Building, as well as what shortly came thereafter in 1897, a Negro Building in Nashville. But they're saying, let's put this on an international stage. So the American Negro exhibit would hang in the Pavilion of Social Economy on the grounds of the Paris's Grand Exposition Universelle that opened in the spring of 1900. So this is 5 years after the Atlanta Exposition. Now, Callaway, who had been a commissioner to the Atlanta Negro Building, promised that the Paris Exposition provided another extraordinary opportunities for blacks to show how far they had advanced in America since slavery. Callaway had worked for Booker T. Washington and shared somewhat similar views on racial uplift. So to rally support and secure exhibits, and this is actually Callaway sitting in the exhibit itself once it was up for view. So to rally support and to secure exhibits, he reminded blacks the relevance of showcasing Negro self-improvement had already proven as a means to advance the economic and social standing of the race. As an example, he noted that, quote, the success of the Negro exhibits at the Nashville and Atlanta Exposition has opened up several factories for Negro labor and crystallized strong sentiment in many parts favoring him as an operative. So he's basically saying this has been really, really productive. It's been, in many ways, excellent advertising. So this Social Economy Pavilion, this is the one in Paris, in comparison to many of the fairground's lavish halls, was a very simple white neoclassical building erected along the Seine. The pavilion was where the U.S. public charities and social reform organizations, that is the settlement houses, you had cooperatives and trade unions, what were then called tenement improvement associations, health organizations, and Negro self-improvement associations set up exhibits. These organizations displayed their successes at disciplining and improving the welfare of America's less capable charges. So its children, its workers, its firm citizens, and Negroes. The limited space, this is actually an image of the improvement. You could see the improvement of the tenement typology, basically, in these models. And what's interesting about the Pavilion of Social Economy, it was the only pavilion that was dedicated to what we now call as information. So there were a lot of graphs and a lot of statistics. Most of the pavilions would show the object, but this was actually showing what we call data. And so it was a radical idea organized by the Ferdinand Laplace, who was the person who figured out the whole classification system of the French World's Fairs, I believe from the 1885, I think it's 1885 fair onward. So he wanted a sociological pavilion to basically say this is how the social sciences are advancing social welfare. So it's a very interesting pavilion in that regard. So within the limited space in the American exhibition, along with the need to present pamphlets and statistical charts, diagrams, maps, photographs, again, like not the people themselves, but photographs of people, lantern slides and models, not the buildings, but models of buildings, meant that the American organizers had to conceive of an ingenious design to display the multiple formats of information. So they had very little space, but they wanted to show a lot of information. So tackling the problem, the New Jersey School and Church Furniture Company designed a unique system of wing frames and wall cabinets to accommodate many exhibits in the cramped space. You had literally like folding walls of display so that you could show things on both sides and drawers. And so it was incredibly kind of ingenious and well-organized show. So the American Negro exhibit, which is area 10 of, this was the whole American exhibit, but area 10, which is on the lower right-hand side, was laid out in an L-shaped configuration and fitted out with the same wooden shelving and display utilized throughout the United States social economy exhibit. It was a much smaller endeavor than the Negro Building in Atlanta. But the exhibit's extensive documentation of photographs and books and newspapers and artwork, as well as industrial artifacts such as patents and products, illustrated a complex panorama of Black life in America. Departing from the Atlanta exposition, where Southern fair builders had clearly segregated the Negro Building from the other main pavilions, marginalizing it near the entertainment venues, white curators presented the American Negro as an integral part of the whole U.S. endeavor. So you don't see the level of segregation. It's almost like a seamless part of the whole narrative of social improvement. So the materials on display emphasized how industrial education bettered the fortunes of the nation's Black masses. Photographs that captured well-appointed single-family homes whose residents adorned the exteriors with modest Victorian and Queen Anne detailing were placed near contrasting views of mud chimney cabinets. So it's the same kind of rationalization of progress, you know, that's being shown in the larger fair was kind of encapsulated in this smaller exhibition. So Callaway engaged the talents of Daniel P. Murray, who was a brilliant assistant librarian at the Library of Congress. He entrusted Murray with the task of assembling an extensive collection of books, newspapers, and sheet music for display. Callaway must have been acutely aware of the implications of this choice, since the Library of Congress's authority would offer irrefutable proof of Black literary achievement. And it's interesting because there's a photograph of Murray's comfortable middle-class home in Washington, D.C., also hanging in an exhibit. In keeping with the theme of industrial education for the Negro, 17 hinged vitrines positioned at eye height and placed on the central wall of the exhibit area contain workshop and agricultural samples from Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. So these were the collages basically produced by Tuskegee, and you could see, you know, Booker T. Washington hung right in the middle of the wall. So he still had this very, very prominent presence there. And so these are the photo montages of campus buildings, fields of crops, and students in industrial training campus. And Tuskegee was actually famous because the students actually built the buildings of the campus. They literally made the bricks. They milled the floorboards. They made the brooms. And so they were literally showing what Black industriousness could make by the production of the campus itself. So it was sort of this learning by doing philosophy that Washington often espoused when he was trying to sort of talk to the white patrons who were supporting the construction of the buildings. So although Washington's authoritarian hand loomed as a formidable presence in the content of the American Negro exhibit, Du Bois's own carefully crafted interpretation of racial progress challenged the powerful leader's impressive reach. Below the vitrines exhibiting Tuskegee's submission, fairgoers could examine the plates and review the data from Du Bois's Georgia Negro study. Rather than show artifacts of rural life or products of manual training, as did the contents of Atlanta's Negro Building and the nearby Tuskegee offering, the Georgia Negro study presented a scientific analysis. In one of the first plates, Du Bois located Georgia within the routes between Africa and the Americas during the African slave trade, indicating the vast extent of what we now identify as the African diaspora. This introductory map drew a historical and spatial sphere in which Black life in Georgia was situated. Now, in spite of the efforts by whites to position Blacks as outside the march of social progress, this first plate confirmed that peoples of African descent throughout the world, including those in Georgia, had participated in and would continue to contribute to the forward advance of civilization and capitalism. Other charts educated viewers on the growth of the Black population in the US, the distribution of city and rural population, and statistics regarding educational enrollment, landholding, miscegenation, marital status, distribution of religious dominations, and so forth. And these are actually really amazing plates. I mean, they're about this big because they're also colored. They're also written both in French and English. And there's an amazing sort of abstract quality, almost a cubist quality about, or de Stijl quality also about the ways in which these graphs are being represented. And this is in 1900, so this is roughly about 1899, and these were prepared by students at Atlanta University under Du Bois's tutelage. So the fair's judges conferred gold medals to Du Bois's Georgia Negro display and Washington's Tuskegee exhibit. But the real triumph occurred when the entire American Negro exhibit received the highly coveted Grand Prix. Du Bois's survey of Atlanta's and Georgia's blacks, whose introductory plate included the pronouncement that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, proved that blacks in America had elevated their status and would continue to advance their welfare despite toiling against the caustic effects of racial segregation and violence, a topic that Washington had evaded in his much lauded Atlanta presentation 5 years before. So what's interesting is that that quote about the color line appears in Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks, but it was actually published here first in a visual form at the Paris Exposition. Now, hearing of the wonderful reception of the American Negro exhibits, citizens in Buffalo, in particular members of the Phyllis Wheatley Club of Colored Women, contacted T.J. Calloway. They hoped to bring this award-winning exhibit from Paris to join their own exhibit on Black progress at the Pan American Exposition being planned for the city in 1901. Now, architects laid out the Pan American Exposition, the extensive fairgrounds, on 350 acres of New York farmland. Now, in an aesthetic move to transcend the earlier Chicago's monochromatic white city, whose whiteness symbolized an east-west axis of Euro-American cultural superiority, the Pan-American planners chose fully to represent a polychromatic north-south racial progress. So it's called Pan-American precisely because it was dealing with South America, Central America, and North America. So it was a very different access. So literally, as planned, visitors entering into what they were calling the Rainbow City, not the White City, the Rainbow City, esplanades, they first witnessed, and this is how it was described by one of the architects, witnessed the cruder barbarian colors of reds, yellows, blues, and greens. After this primary color assortment, their view shifted from the middle ground pavilions, whose refined color palette lightened to a pale gray, blue, and buff hues. Finally, in the distance, their gazes lighted upon a crescendo of ivory and white hues enveloping the beacon of the electric tower, which at night beamed a great searchlight to illuminate the noble prospect beyond. With hierarchies of race and nation as the framework, a narrative of civilization was carefully embedded in the visual and spatial order of the fairgrounds, as had been in other fairs. Now, the reports of the award-winning Parisian exhibit and the success of the Negro buildings in Atlanta and Nashville inspired other groups to want to display their accomplishments and local efforts of social advancement. The members of the Phyllis Wheatley Club were adamant about having Black representation at the forthcoming Buffalo Exposition. A determined coalition that included clubwoman Mary Burnett Talbert and attorney journalist James A. Ross protested to the Pan American Exposition Board in the fall of 1900 about the exclusion of Black involvement. And this was happening constantly. Blacks would say, we want to be involved, and the organizing boards would say no. That's why the Atlanta Fair was very radical. It was the first time they said, no, we want to have you here. This happened in Philadelphia. This happened in the Great Fair at Chicago. There was no cohesive Black exhibition allowed in Chicago. Even though various people appeared in other pavilions and work was shown in the art exhibits. So Atlanta was exceptional in that way, but every time, like in St. Louis, blacks tried to organize an exhibit collectively, but they were turned down. So Atlanta was a very, very, very radical move, actually, in that regard. So again, in Buffalo, they were going to try this again. So by the time Calloway arrived in Buffalo at the end of the year to propose the exhibition, the governing board, some of who had attended the Atlanta Fair and had witnessed the success of Atlanta's Negro Building, was willing to incorporate the American Negro exhibit into the displays at the Pan American Exposition. And so this is how it was shown in Buffalo. So you see the vitrines, the maps, the photographs of the American Negro exhibit fill the corner of the social economy section in this sprawling, what was there called the Liberal Arts Building. Under the stewardship of Ross, mentioned in one newspaper as the assistant in charge of the Negro exhibits, Callaway and Du Bois's entire exhibit was on hand, with additional material added to highlight local issues and people. And so you could see the same photograph. There's Booker T. Washington, there's the charts, there's the Georgia Negro, there are the model homes. Like, all of this stuff was exhibited in a slightly different order, but nonetheless it was all there. But despite the American Negro's exhibit's exquisitely crafted message of racial progress, racist propaganda, as had been at other U.S. fairs, could be seen all around Buffalo's Rainbow City. Buttressing the exposition's social Darwinist theme seen elsewhere on the fairgrounds, the Darkest Africa attraction, a village of 98, quote, Africans funded by the Buffalo Society of Natural Sciences, and across the way, yet another old plantation concession, proved popular venues along the Pan-American's Midway. Now, keenly aware of the value of Black participation at the Atlanta, Paris, and Buffalo fairs, Booker T. Washington campaigned for Charleston, South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition. I mean, these titles of these things are unbelievable. And they all have these, like, very long subtitles as well. So he campaigned to have a Negro Building in Charleston. Washington made his request to the fair planners, even though the state and municipal legislatures of South Carolina had been the most aggressive in disenfranchising Black male voters from their constitutional right to cast ballots and their right to be elected to political office. So South Carolina was actually the first state to basically remove the right from Black women couldn't vote, but Black male voters could vote and had been able to achieve some political success within the state. And you kind of see this played out in Birth of a Nation. I mean, that was sort of modeled on what was going on in South Carolina. So to avoid the large crowds sauntering around the fairgrounds in Charleston's stifling summer heat and humidity, Charleston's fair builders hired, again, Bradford Gilbert to design the pavilions, which planned to commence the exposition in the temperate months of December 1901, opening its gates just 1 month after the Pan American Exposition closed. So Buffalo closed, and then this fair in South Carolina opened. So that's what was amazing about researching these fairs, was you realized how often they were happening. So holding steadfast to Old South traditions rather than the Upland's New South agenda, white organizers initially proposed that the Negro Building's aesthetic decor should recall that of nearby antebellum cotton and rice plantations. In keeping with Old South nostalgia, they even planned to recreate slave quarters around this homestead to best showcase the development of the Negro race. As designed by Gilbert and built by Black work crews, a Spanish mission-style pavilion housed Charleston's collection representing Negro industriousness, which was fortunately displayed without the historical recreation of the slave dependency. So that didn't happen, but you can see, you know, very kind of similar display of just handicraft, sewing, canning, basically what was the outcome of industrial education, which is a very, very, very different message than what was shown in Paris. So Callaway was briefly involved in the preparations for the Charleston event. His award-winning American Negro exhibit, including Du Bois's Georgia Negro study, was featured as one of the Negro Building's main display, and so was Daniel Murray. He also did a collection of books and works also for this fair. So the same people are basically going from fair to fair, organizing these Black exhibits. So except for the presence of Du Bois's finely honed sociological and historical analysis of the impact of anti-Black racism and segregation on Black life in Georgia, Charleston's Negro Building deliberately shunned any explicit protest of the social inequalities or the question of suffrage. Led by Booker T. Washington in his mandate of patient accommodation, Black organizers seemed unwilling to antagonize their white patrons. Now, the seamless representation of the cooperative Southern Negro at the Charleston Fair was shattered, however, by a divisive row over the installation of a large statue that paid homage to the region's plantation culture. In his role as chief architect, Gilbert envisioned in front of the stately main court of palaces 4 statues depicting the original racial groups of the region. The chief architect proposed that the 16-foot-tall sculpture of the Negro group be placed instead in front of the Negro Building instead of the main court. So for Gilbert's interpretation of Negro progress, artist George A. Lopez carved a stalwart negress, this is how she's described, in full stride, balancing a basket overflowing with cotton pickings on her head. She stood adjacent to a crouching blacksmith hammering away at an anvil, his well-worked sinews telling the life dedicated to manual labor. Rounding out the trio sat a jovial banjo player, smiling and strumming away on his cherished instrument. This animated, larger-than-life trio possessed distinctly African features, negating the historical reality that many blacks in the South, because of centuries of miscegenation, possessed decidedly Euro-American features. This stereotypical representation, symbolically positioned by white organizers in front of Black Charlestonians' temple to racial progress, deeply insulted blacks, especially the educated leadership who complained to the organizing committee. Eventually relenting, the apologetic Washington had the offensive sculpture carted away. But the white fair administrators, confident and proud of their homage to Negro progress, simply relocated their gift to a more prominent site on the fairgrounds before the commencement of the fair, which ran from December to May. Now, insulted by the repositioning of the demeaning ensemble and the jury's award, it gave it like a silver medal, of course. Let me show you. That's what it looked like. Black patrons, a significant portion of the fair's audience, boycotted the exposition. And I believe, if I recall the statistics from the book, Charleston in that area was still at least 60% black. So that was a huge, 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 which included the so-called mulatto class, but it was huge. And so there was a kind of politic about trying to disenfranchise. That's why they disenfranchised black voters, because they actually were the majority. So it was the only way to hold on to the power. So they insulted basically the people who were going to pay the tickets to go here. So they boycotted. So for the ambitious white organizers, the Interstate and West Indian Exposition was ruled, after the ticket receipts had been totaled, a financial fiasco. So to conclude, why were the fairs important precursors to the current black museums? Well, one reason is because the expositions were in fact public spheres and public spaces. They were open, if unintentionally, to alternative representation to American industry, culture, and national identity. When confronted with these powerful and persuasive narratives of civilization, Black Americans used the fairs to vigorously respond to how they were being portrayed and positioned. Washington, Du Bois, Callaway, and a host of other fair builders, including people like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, sought to disprove the bleak forecast augured by their fellow white citizens by taking measure of their own advancement. Inside the ideologically charged atmosphere of the mainstream fairs, Negro buildings in Atlanta and Charleston, and eventually in the Black organized emancipation expositions, this was one done in 1915 in Chicago. This was organized by W.E.B. Du Bois in New York. The spacious wood and stone halls offered prospects where Black citizens could witness their own progress as a race and as a nation. So there was always particularly in the emancipation expositions, the split about whether, because of segregation, there was a separate Black nation and a separate Black culture. Groups of Black citizens formulated bold counter-narratives to American progress. They created public spaces where disenfranchised Blacks from across the African diaspora could imagine a world free from subjugation. At the expositions and eventually at the early grassroots museums in the 1960s, so this was the 75th anniversary of the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. This was in Chicago in 1940, and the last one, which is the 100th anniversary, was in 1963 in Chicago. And then after that, the emancipation expositions actually ended. But what's interesting is that right around that time, in the early 60s, was one of the first what I call public museums, what I call grassroots public museums. And this is the Ebony Museum, which was started in 1961 by Margaret Burroughs, who passed away last year. And then there was also the museum in Detroit, This was the International Afro-American Museum, which is now the Charles H. Wright Museum in Detroit. So the expositions and eventually the early grassroots museums of the 60s offered a range of strategies from accommodation to civil rights to self-determination, Black nationalism, to alternative national belongings, that is Pan-Africanism. These complementary and conflicting strategies were all aimed toward elevating their collective fortunes against the rising tide of anti-Black racism in the United States and around the world. And so what's interesting is that the book basically covers the Jim Crow era. And so all of this is happening precisely sort of as an outcome of segregation, trying to figure out, like, well, what does it mean to be Black and American? And so what's interesting is that the activism, particularly of these early grassroots museums from the 60s, sort of through the 70s, radically shifts with the new right agenda that emerges in the 70s and the building of these large permanent buildings in places like Birmingham and in Memphis and eventually in Chicago and also in Detroit. And so what Negro Building does is it tells the story of their visionary responses and daring propositions. So this is the Charles Wright Museum, African American History. This was the third building actually for the museum, done in 1996. And thank you. So I don't know if anybody has questions. Question?
Hi, John Templeton. I'm working on a context statement for African American Freedom Trail in San Francisco. You didn't mention the Panama Pacific in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'd like you to explore was that here, the African American community was actually building its own churches to go along with Panama Pacific exposition. So how would that have changed the fact that they built their own church buildings, one of which is still standing, to actually welcome folks, as opposed
This was on the fairgrounds.
No, this is actually, these are outside the city. The first AME Zion that was at Webster and Geary and Third Baptist, which is still up on Hyde Street, is the oldest Black church building in the state.
But they were built around the same time as the
it was built right after the earthquake, and there was a conscious effort to welcome people coming to the exposition. They actually had the AME General Conference in San Francisco to welcome that. So, but do you mention that in the book?
I do not talk about that specific exposition because there's so many. I mean, what's interesting is that there are a lot of these things that are happening. So I kind of trace a particular genealogy of a group of people that are just going from one fair to the next fair to the next. But you bring up a lot of things that are really critical that I didn't mention in this just sort of overview is the role of the Black church. That a number of the people, there was Bishop Turner, who was a very early Black nationalist. He went to Liberia often, Sierra Leone. And he was an early advocate, actually, for the Negro Building in Atlanta. He also had an exhibit at the Atlanta. That's what I mean. Not everybody was pro-industrial education. He actually had artifacts from from West Africa, actually, in the show to basically say, we didn't just learn these skills here in the United States. We had them prior to coming here. So he had this kind of very, very radical sort of position within the building itself. So there was already a dissonance. But one of the things that happened, which I talk about in this first chapter, was that when they were planning, let's say, the Atlanta Fair, one of the things they had to plan for, they had to build hotels. They had to, and they were really worried about segregated rail cars. They thought people were not going to come from Washington, D.C. or New York or Chicago because of that. And so they actually went to the organizing board and said, look, you know, we can't put up with this. We're not going to get people to come. And they said, well, we have no control over that, although these are the people that own the railroads, right? So we can't control that, but we'll give you money, right? So they gave them money, actually, to finish building the building. So it's a very complex negotiation, and they knew if they separate, there was a big debate, if we take the separate pavilion are we accepting segregation? And that was a big debate. And a lot of this happened in churches, like Big Bethel in Atlanta, which is where they were, sort of talking about the outcome of these. So the churches were really important, and they had to build hotels, they had to have restaurants, they had to build an entire infrastructure because blacks couldn't stay in the mainstream hotels and couldn't even eat in some of the dining rooms in the fairgrounds.
And to your point about sort of a traveling, one of the things that the denominations did, and also one of the influences of Tuskegee, was that there were supervising architects for the black denominations. So there's actually a common style that can be seen around the country of churches that were built in that era, because they actually had in fact, I think Turner actually was an advocate of the Gothic style because he wanted to show. So, but happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, no, Booker T. Washington actually wanted Robert Taylor, who was the first black architect educated at MIT, I think, to actually do the original Negro Building in Atlanta. That's who he proposed, but Bradford Gilbert ended up designing it. So, and William Pittman, who did the one in Jamestown, was Booker T. Washington's son-in-law. So, patronage as always.
Sure. I don't have a real question, but maybe you can patch my comments into a question, and they deal with the fact that they start the book, the intro, saying that world fairs don't happen anymore. So that got me started in thinking, well, kind of the world fairs that we have today are G8 summits, G20 summits, and we just had the Doha climate talks. I was wondering if you could kind of push fast forward to your book, which you don't have to do, and say in today's world what we're looking at is these are our world fairs, and where do we see the analog of what happened in the movement building and sustaining both history and cultural artifacts and production going forward with this. And I put in the Doha climate summits very purposefully because you referenced the idea of using raw materials, using brown labor, and all of that stuff very purposefully. And as architects, that's what we do. We turn raw materials into products. So can you synthesize it?
Yeah, no, I think it's no, very clear question actually. No, that's when I said these things had these crazy subtitles, because like it's turning around. It's like the one in Philadelphia is to turn raw materials into manufacturers. The first great exposition in England had this really same thing about manufacturers. So it's all about these fairs. For the most, they had two reasons. The main ones, they either had to do with manufacturing, so that they were basically bringing people together to open up new markets. That was part of it. That's why the Pan-American, it was like for Americans to open up markets in South America, basically to show the superiority of American goods in American manufacturers. So they were economic or they were historical, right? So they were commemorative to basically show the advancement of the nation, right? And so there was this interesting way in which nation and political economy basically get merged into these events. And they were private corporations, people sold stakes in them. I mean, they're very interesting to study the infrastructure about how these things worked in a way. And so they are definitely precursors to precisely what you are talking about these international summits. However, the difference is that this is the rise of the nation state. So the ones in the 19th century are clearly about that. Nations competing against nations. The later ones start to deal more with like technology, like the cities of tomorrow and so forth. My theory is that once we're able to see literally the world in miniature from the Apollo, literally like in '69, it's almost, you don't need to recreate the world in miniature, right? Because you've actually seen the world in miniature. So my theory is that there's a whole other kind of almost epistemological framework that emerges out of that moment of the space flight. Like you just don't need to gather all of this stuff. And it's also an outcome of transnationalism and globalization that's also happening, like right at that shift in the 70s. So, but there's the Shanghai Expo that happened that has its own rationale. And it's funny because that replicates it. Let's show, the Chinese how we're going to be living in cities in 40 years. We're going to make basically re-script domestic life from most of China and just bring people there for free so that they can see how they're going to be living. So it's the same rationale that can work. So I don't know if that that answers the question, but yeah, but it's a good one. But these were very much about the rise of industrial capitalism, but also the emergence of the nation state, which have everything to do with like race, culture, progress. So there were questions in the back. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you started out mentioning the museum, the National Museum that is to come. Do you have an understanding of whether or not this legacy kind of plays in or connects at all to the design of the museum?
The current design of the museum. That museum is a big challenge in a way. I think the message that Lonnie Bunch, who's the director, and they have a really amazing staff of curators and people who've conceptualized the museum. The thing that I kind of note sort of toward the epilogue in the book is that once these institutions, literally you could see this in Detroit, once they get these buildings, they have to have trustees, they have to have staff, and they were much more agile activist organizations in the 60s because they just weren't burdened by that. So Detroit was brilliant because they literally had, I love this thing, I actually gave a talk about this thing at a Mumford conference, because this mobile museum could move across Chicago, any place. They could literally bring the museum anywhere, right? And so it was a pretty kind of radical notion. That a friend of mine who's an architectural historian at Princeton was saying that this was a model that the UN was actually using in parts of Africa. And the person who founded this museum had done USAID work in Africa, so it might have been where he got the idea. But the idea that this could move precisely because consciousness raising was a part of a kind of black nationalist civil rights movement in the 60s in Detroit, which Wright was very supportive of, was really critical. So these early museums were very, very political. Margaret Burroughs was a communist in the 50s. She allied with labor unions. I mean, they had a much more activist base. And so part of the reason I wanted to write the book was to remind people of, with these current museums, that the legacy of this work, these collections, as a place to show artists. I mean, it was amazing once I started to look at these things. This was the one place where black artists could actually show their work publicly. So you get all of the major black artists showing in these venues and collaborating actually with the curators, with the architects to do projects here. But then, you know, when they become much more mainstream institutions, the question becomes, does that political activism stay extant and critical? And I don't know if that's still going to be a part, whether that gets compromised in the Smithsonian or not. I think we shall see. And I haven't talked to the director, so I don't know what Lonnie thinks about the book. Tirza.
I'm struck that your press, UC Press, in 2012 also published a book called The Women's Building, and that was about the Chicago, the women's building of the Chicago World's Fair, because you were showing your PowerPoint and orienting us in all of these other World's Fair campuses. A couple of times we noticed in Charleston, I think, and elsewhere, women's buildings in those contexts. And I'm wondering whether you thought about the kind of the relationship of the logic of the women's building in relation to the Negro building.
I think there was oftentimes parallels. Like people would argue, in certain instances, well, if we're going to have a women's building, why couldn't we have a Negro building? Within the Negro building, there clearly gets to be racial politics, like with Ida B. Wells in Chicago, for example. Like I know the one in Atlanta, there were literally black nannies. I mean, there's an amazing photograph, stereoscope, I think, of black nannies sitting in which I believe is the nursery of the women's building. So there's a kind of class and racial politics that also gets played out in the women's building as well, and what that served as an institution within that. I did not know about that book. I'd be really, really curious. And what's interesting is that black women also modeled themselves often, you know, in trying to have their own black women's exhibit. They would have black women's congresses also in the Negro buildings. And the first organization of the National Congress of, Color Women's Congress, or I always forget the acronym for it, but that actually happened first in Atlanta. and then became this organization that is still around. Mary McLeod Bethune was the leader of that organization. I think it still exists. So the women's building did serve as, I think, a model, but there was also some contention about whether black women could participate or not, even though they shared a lot of similar interest in suffrage, women's rights, you know, the role of women within the household or within public life. So, but I will definitely take a look at that book. So, any other?
I'm trying to remember, because I've read your book, with the Paris exposition, how is that rhetorically framed in terms of the French colonial sections, particularly?
Can you speak up?
I was wondering, for the French exhibitions, how rhetorically it was framed in terms of the colonial exhibitions at that same fair, particularly with the French colonies in Africa.
Yeah, it's funny because I almost went down that road. Because I actually did go to Paris and I looked at the archives of the sociological. It's not a sociological institute, but it's where they basically have kept a lot of the documentation in that. And I actually was curious comparatively about that. But I actually looked in the US press and I could not find any kind of reference to that at all. But there is a kind of politics that happens amongst Black Americans in relation to anyone else in Africa, because Black Americans will do exactly that same kind of scale of civilization and progress, and you would hear this in some of the transcripts from the congresses. Well, you know, we as civilized Negroes, right? We're not Africans. I mean, they literally would say that we are not, and they would do this kind of monolithic Africa, right? So not saying that we are the Bantu people or whomever, and they would basically say, well, we've progressed beyond that. We are also, some of us are half white, so why should we be cast with the so-called primitive? So there starts to be a kind of interracial politic about that often happens, to basically argue, you know, we are your social equal, actually. But I didn't, from the stuff that I found, just reading like Du Bois's correspondences, reading stuff that Calloway, because Calloway was the editor of The Colored American, like reading through all of that stuff, I didn't find any direct references, although the blacks that traveled to Paris, I mean, they were tourists. I mean, they were just like any other American. You should go to the Eiffel Tower. This is where you should have, you know, like a meal or. But I couldn't find any sort of direct comparison with that. Although there was apparently like an Aunt Jemima concession somewhere in the American, within the American, some American exhibit or something like that, but no direct comparison. So, great, well thank you all for coming this evening.